So 504 covers places that get federal funds, okay? So that would include your school, obviously. Whereas Title II covers anything that's a government program, whether or not they receive federal funds, or if they, for example, they could just have state funds. So what Title II says, Title II of the ADA says, you cannot discriminate against somebody who's, in a government program on the basis of the person's disability. And so that would include, any public entity, irrespective of whether they got federal or state money. Now, purely private industries are regulated by Title III. An example of that would be, let's say you wanted to take a bus from the Reno airport to State Line and you needed wheelchair access. Title III imposes requirements on the private entity not to discriminate. But for our purposes, Title II is defined as, any disability pretty much is covered. So the question is, what constitutes a disability? And that is a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity. And so Title II goes on to define physical or mental impairment and major life activity. So most diseases or conditions are going to be covered: cancer, diabetes, autism, Alzheimer's, dementia. And interestingly, though, homosexuality and bisexuality are not covered. Now, major life activities are kind of like what they sound like, self-care, walking, hearing, seeing, moving, all those things. So Title II is intended to give broad protections to people who are in places, essentially public places, and require accommodations because of their disabilities. Now, if you're in an old building, as I was for many years, that had no elevator, which was very uncool for a disability attorney, but the rent you couldn't beat. If you're in an old building, there's no duty on the part of the owner to retrofit that building. But where new buildings are being constructed, there are now very stringent rules about access. So that would include things like having elevators and lots of other things that allow people to use the building. One of the ideas in Title II is that you aren't going to force people into separate programs. It's kind of like the least restrictive environment thing. If you need to give somebody an aid or a TDD system or an interpreter or large print or headsets or something like that in order for them to be able to use a public facility, then you've got, and a public program, you can't segregate them from other people. And then enforcement of Title II is mainly left to the Department of Justice if you want to file a complaint, or of course, if you've got a bona fide discrimination case, you can file a lawsuit. And then there's kind of different entities that enforce different parts. So for example, the Department of Education makes sure that libraries are accessible to people and people aren't discriminated against and can't use the libraries. Health and Human Services regulates the nursing profession. HUD regulates discrimination in housing. The Department of Interior and Parks, the Department of Interior is responsible for the parks. So if you go to Yosemite, or recently I was on the campus of the University of California at Santa Cruz, that's another question, I suppose. They have accessible paths and things like that. There are paths at the beach that are wheelchair accessible. So this is a huge undertaking on the part of the state and federal government to make places accessible to people that have disabilities. So that's kind of what I wanted to tell everybody about Title II. It's a broad statute intended to give people access and to prevent people from being discriminated against in places that are used by the public.
So can I ask you one quick question, Bonnie?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So if you are having an argument about least restrictive environment, then you can say this is a violation of Title II.
Conceivably, there are going to be situations where you have violations under 504, Title II, and IDEA. You're absolutely right, because there is some overlap. And we didn't really touch on, and it's kind of a separate program, but it's an interesting one, I think. What about the whole business of service dogs and companion dogs at school? How does that work?
Right.
That's a service that makes school accessible for people. But we're not doing that today because we don't have time.
Okay. Another day. We'll save that for another day.